Welcome to the Anthony Foster Laboratory Nelson Memorial Award Ceremony. My name is Lian Shen. I'm the director of Anthony Foster Laboratory. And today, I'm so happy to see our friends from many places, but especially bioengineering and the former colleagues of Nels. And also, I want to thank the family of Nels and friends, okay, and alumni, okay, coming here for this special occasion, okay. And we are going to give out this year's Nelson Award winner to a student, okay, and we are going to hear exciting research, okay, from the student winner himself, okay, and then, okay, we are also going to hear the keynote lecture, okay, by Omid, okay, and well, okay, I will speak less than usual because really, okay, today, okay, there are going to be a lot of, okay, nice introduction and presentations from this point on. So next, I'm going to hand this to Jeff, okay, our Associate Director for Engineering and Facilities, to introduce the Nelson Award.
Thank you. Thanks, Leon. Hi, everybody. My name is Jeff Marr. I'm the Associate Director of Engineering and Facilities here at SAFL. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many friends, familiar faces. And today we're here to celebrate the Nels Nelson Memorial Fellowship and the student and our guest speaker, Omid Mohseni, here as well. So Nels was an important person in our lives, in many of our lives. Nels was trained as a civil engineer here at the University of Minnesota. He received his bachelor's and master's degree, receiving his master's degree in 1980. He studied under Edward Bowers, one of the faculty members here at SAFL at the time. And I did a little bit of searching in our project reports. There's 2 project reports that I could find that Nels was a co-author of. Interestingly, one of them is on the hydrology of the copper-nickel regions of Northeast Minnesota. And that's a topic that Bar Engineering continues to work heavily on today, I believe, and is also a really important topic for our state. And this was before Nels joined Bar Engineering, so it's kind of an interesting tie-in. So of course, Nels worked here at SAFL in the late 70s, earned his master's in 1980, and he was also an Anderson Award winner in 1979. After graduating, he joined Bar Engineering, where he made many contributions in his technical work, but also as a part of the leadership team at Bar Engineering. He served as what Bar has a title called the facilitator for their different work groups, and he served as a facilitator for many years. I don't know if anybody knows the number of years, 15 years or so as a facilitator of that group. So quite an impact for his work there. Of course, there's many, if you look around, there's many people in the room that worked alongside Nels, perhaps were hired by Nels or was a collaborator or friend. And so we're really glad to have you here today. I got to work with Nels for a short time as an intern. I interned at Bar Engineering for a few years, and I just remember him being a really wise person. He was kind of a mentor for me as I was making choices early in life about graduate school or continuing on into consulting. And even though I chose a life of academia, Nels was always very supportive of my decisions, and I appreciated that. Nels passed away in January of 2010, and to honor his memory, Bar Engineering, along with his family, established this fellowship. It's a pretty amazing thing, and it continues today. The award is $8,000 awarded annually to one of our graduate students here at SAFL. And it's an award that goes to a student that's giving consideration to something in the area of water resource engineering. And so it's a legacy that's been started and continued, and we're happy to celebrate it today. So with that, I'm gonna invite Michele Guala forward to present this year's awardee.
So welcome everyone. My name is Michele Guala. I'm a professor in civil engineering. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to Michael Chiappone. So he's a perfect example of a Safalesque student working in a Safalesque collaboration of people. Peter Makovicki is the Earth Science Advisor at UMN. Other members of the team is Professor Chris Paola, myself, and Raymond Rogers from McAllister. So it's a very diverse group, mixed of earth scientists and engineers. And I have to thank you, Jeff Marr, for establishing this, because you initiated this collaboration. So that was really nice. So Michael is a paleontologist, so he's not an hydraulic engineer or a coder, right? But he has lots of talent, so he's a very good sketchist. So he's borderline artist. He can draw things, and we will see a lot of nice slides in this presentation. And he has the right question. So he has a deep understanding of fossil sites. And the question is how to make those qualitative understanding more quantitative, so that we could run some experiments here and learn something how to interpret better the fossil record. So that's why the collaboration took place. And the other thing that was important, was really a driving force, is that Michael has a great enthusiasm. So when he was running an experiment in the main channel, he was driving a crowd, and everybody, even Ben, you were interested in coming out and see the experiments, and the staff were coming out, and so it was very, very interesting and fun to watch and to participate to those experiments that deals with the sediment transport and many other things that we will learn. So, and I'm a middle-aged, kind of grumpy engineer. So when Michael was looking at the ball and say, hey, look at how the scapula moves with all this enthusiasm, it was really a driving force. So because of this driving force, what was supposed to be like a master work with a few preliminary experiments ended up in a kind of a PhD work with lots of experiment, lots of passion, lots of enthusiasm, and great results. So I'm very thankful to you. I'm very thankful to SAFL for establishing this collaboration. And that's it. So congratulations, Michael. Here is a very well-deserved award. And Lian, you want to come for the picture because we need the official seal of the director.
Well, again, thank you so much, Michele, for that kind introduction. And as Michele said, my name is Michael Chiappone. I am a very different kind of student that I think normally shows up at SAFL, but I'm really grateful to have gotten to spend a lot of time doing research here throughout my PhD so far. It's been a really fascinating place to work. So before I get into any science, I really want to emphasize thanking Barr Engineering immensely and the family of Nels Nelson for establishing this fellowship in honor of Nels. It's not only the nomination of it means a lot to me, but just receiving it will enable me to really continue the experiments that I'm doing and push this project forward in a way that wouldn't be possible otherwise. So thank you so much for that. I greatly value you all's support. And on top of that, I do also have to thank one more group of people, and that is my committee, who Michele kind of introduced a little bit, but on the left there, you won't see him so much around here because he's over in earth science at the moment teaching, but Pete Makovicki is my advisor, along with these other great folks that are on the committee who have taught me so much about not only taphonomy, but fluid dynamics, sedimentology, and the process of doing science overall. This is really the crack team that makes this project possible. So thank you all so much for all of y'all's support. And with that, I guess what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start as broad as I possibly can, because a lot of paleontologists aren't exactly coming through this building. I wanna start with what the overall goal is of a paleontologist. As a paleontologist, my aim is to reconstruct the history of life on this planet. How have ancient ecosystems evolved and changed and responded to extinction and changes in the environment such that they create the ecosystems that we have around us today? And how will they respond to changes that are happening in our environment currently that will drive them forward into the future? But in order to do this, we use fossil data, bones and other remains of animals, plants, fungi, that can tell us about life in the past. But in order to do that, we really need to understand deeply where our data actually comes from. And so back in the 1940s, this guy, Ivan Yefremov, this paleontologist from Soviet Russia, really pushed forward this idea that we need to understand where our data comes from, and invented an entire subfield of paleontology called taphonomy, which is my main focus as a researcher. He noted that taphonomy essentially concerns itself with the transition in all of its details of organic remains from the biosphere to the lithosphere. How does something that is alive become converted into the fossils that we actually pull out of the ground? And so that is what this entire subfield concerns itself with. From the moment an organism keels over and dies, all the way to when we pull it out of the ground in order to study it, and some people even argue beyond there into things like museum collections and whatnot. Where does the fossil record itself actually come from? And what biases underlie it that we really need to be cognizant of when we're trying to understand how life on Earth has evolved? Within that realm, my specific area of study, which makes a lot of sense for SAFL, is the fluvial realm. In the terrestrial world, over half of all of the vertebrate bone beds that have ever been found are from rivers and their floodplains. And if a bone is in water flow of any kind, it's often going to experience some level of transport, and if it's an entire skeleton, sorting based on what bone it is. And this affects paleoecological hypotheses that we can actually make in the fossil record. You know, did the fossil assemblage that you're finding in a given place start out there? Did those organisms keel over and die in the local area, or have they been moved some distance that suggests that ecologically you can't trust that they lived there? Are certain bones more likely to be preserved than other ones? That affects what data you have to work with. These are important questions for rivers specifically. And it turns out that SAFL is kind of a perfect place to test this kind of thing through experimental methods, which among paleontologists are generally not common. But among taphonomists, experiments are actually really a great way to examine this kind of thing. People have done things like decay experiments, transport experiments, burial experiments, all sorts of different things. And SAFL is uniquely positioned to explore questions about how bones move, sort, and bury in fluid flow. And so that's where we started. Early on was in the main channel downstairs, if you've seen that, the 3-meter wide by 80-meter long flume that we've got, where we decided to start by testing what kinds of different flows that people have never tested before can influence bones. In this case, we tested what happens when overbank flows like levee breaches, crevasse splays, can move bones that are out on the floodplain and potentially bury them in a situation kind of like what you see here, where this levee has broken and water is now spread out onto the floodplain, depositing sediment along with it. And we found a lot of really interesting stuff in this work that I won't go too far into for today's sake. But know that this research is actually about to get published pretty soon here in the journal Paleobiology. So feel free to look for more on that pretty soon. But moving forward, what we've now kind of pivoted to is we've downsized our flume. We've ended up in what's called the tilting bed flume, one that's a little less than 1 meter wide, and really getting at the underlying processes that actually act to move a bone in any fluid flow, and trying to see if we can predict, based on certain characteristics of the bones that we know, things like density, things like size and shape, that we can actually predict what kinds of shear stresses it would take to move bones as objects, thinking of them less as organisms and more as weird sediments, basically. And we've noticed other things as we've done this more quantitative approach as well. We've noticed that bones have really important interactions with the bed form roughness around them, the things that they're actually interacting with sediment-wise on the bottom of a river. Things like ripples and dunes that can trap them via eddying and things like that, as well as bury them for temporary lengths of time, sometimes permanent, by their ever-forward march downstream. On top of that, we've also seen the effects of something called scouring, which if you don't know what that is, if you've ever been to the beach and you've stood in the sand as a wave is pulling away from you and you felt the sand rushing out from under you, that's scouring. And it's basically when sediment is mobile around an immobile object. And what happens is that you create eddies around the back of the object that slow the water down in these recirculation currents. And what that can do is if you have larger sediments like gravel moving around a bone, they can end up caught in those eddies and redeposit on the downstream side of your bone. And sure enough, recently when I was out in the field, I saw this firsthand at a real-world dinosaur site in which multiple bones showed packets of pebbles on one side, assumedly the downstream side. And what we can do is combine this sort of qualitative examination of fossil sites with the quantitative methods that we're building in order to see, for instance, if we know how much shear stress it takes for a bone to move, we can compare that to how much shear stress it takes gravel to move. And we can see and test that scouring hypothesis. Would the gravel have been moving when the bone wasn't? Is the bone harder to move than gravel is? In this case, it turns out that it was. And so it may be possible to use the surrounding geologic context to actually constrain flow conditions relative to bones themselves that we see at real-world fossil sites, really taking this to a new quantitative level. And so overall, what I really want to emphasize today more than anything else is that the fossil record is humanity's window into understanding how ancient ecosystems functioned and how they evolved. And these, fossils that we actually use to understand fossil record are found in a geologic context, which represents the landscapes that they were deposited on. And because of this, understanding how fossils are actually preserved really impacts how we can actually interpret them and what data we can use for what purposes. And not only this, but taphonomic processes actually still happen today. And they're used to learn about modern ecosystems and even sometimes human issues. Things like forensics and archaeologists use some of the same methods we are all the time. And on top of that, fluid mechanics are also really important on complex shapes in general, not just bones. And so this may also be applicable to other non-bone objects, especially cylindrical objects in fluid flow. And so with that, I will go ahead and wrap up. Thank you all so much for stopping by to watch, and that is just how the femur tumbles. Thank you.
Any questions? We have time for a few questions. Yeah, Charles.
I'm just curious about your use of the term constrains. You were saying it constrains conditions. What are you trying to say there, or saying there?
So by constraining flow conditions, basically what I'm saying is that we might not be able to pin down an exact number of the water was moving exactly this fast in exactly this direction at this time, but we might be able to at least put some bounds on it, some reasonable bounds that say, okay, this is a level of flow that's somewhere on the order of a meter a second or what have you, in a depth that is somewhere in the range of half a meter deep. Something that, obviously we can't know the exact flow conditions down to the millimeter level, but this is a much higher level of constraint than we've ever had on this kind of thing, quantitatively.
Other questions?
So, Michael, this is really great that you have the shear stress plot up. So I was curious, maybe a question and a follow-up question. First question is this the dimensional shear stress or a shield stress?
Good point. This is a shield stress.
Okay, so it'll take a little in-the-head conversion, but what I'm wondering about is typically sand-bed rivers will adjust their widths to have like dimensional shear stresses on the order of, let's say, 2 to 20 pascals.
Right.
So bearing that in mind, I'm just curious about like what that means in terms of likely mobility or your expectations for what the bone beds would do.
Yeah, of course. So I think part of that is going to be determined, again, by that geologic context. Let's say you have a fossil site, what part of a river are you actually in? I assume you're speaking mostly laterally, whether you're in the deeper parts of the river or closer to the shallows kind of thing, right?
Actually, I'm saying for the entire river, so it will adjust its width until it more or less has a width that's at around the critical shear stress to detach cohesive particles from the banks.
Right.
So that the river on average, if we think about it, kind of average rectangular geometry,
Yes.
will have, depending on the bank material, if it's relatively non-cohesive, closer to 2 pascals. If it's relatively cohesive, closer to 20 pascals
Right.
of bankful shear stress. And I'm curious what that means for mobility, or not so much mobility, of different parts of the animal. Going back to the first question you asked about how close are we to the ecological context?
Right, right. So I don't recall exactly what this converts to dimensionally, but typically, at least in the, the classic Shields curve, if you think about something like gravel, the larger Reynolds number of particles, those are going to sit somewhere around 0.05-ish, which is where our gravel fell out when we ran it through that same equation. So my feeling would be that, at least from our experiments, most of our bones were mobile at that or somewhere a little bit after that. You can see we go up to about observed-wise, not our predicted, given that there's a fair amount of wiggle room there. In terms of our observed shear stress, we're up to about 0.2-ish. So my feeling would be that most bones are going to move at some point, if they are on a riverbed surface, at some point throughout the year relative to the maximum flow conditions of that river. So do you have, say, 2 or 3 times a year, you get a bigger pulse of water flow moving through? During that time, when you might get adjustments in the bank and things like that, you'd probably get the most movement then. And then once you, again, speaking to critical shear stress, once you fall below that value for whatever bone it is, let's say we have a bone plotting out where our limb bone is here. Once our shear stress of the river overall falls below that point, most of the rest of the year, probably not so extreme of movement, meaning that probably the most extreme movements are going to happen during the highest flows, which is a little obvious, but I think makes the most sense.
Other questions?
Clarification to Andy's question. So this is normalized using rho s minus rho GNDS with the rho s of the bone. So it's normalized in the same way you would normalize a particle with certain density. So you can multiply that and you get your dimensional shear stress. Yeah.
I was curious if you can talk a bit about your January, February experiments.
Yeah, of course, I can talk a little bit about that. So I didn't go into the in-depth of what we were using bone-wise just for time's sake. We did use some, you might have seen them up front, we used some 3D printed models of dinosaur bones initially in those flash flood experiments and compared them to real bones like this one. This is a sheep femur. Of roughly the same size to kind of think about, the differences in shape and things like that that might affect movement in flow. In our more recent experiments, what you're seeing there is a series of 7 different species of modern animal in addition to our hadrosaur, including the sheep, that are a range of different sizes all the way down to little femurs that are like that big on a bird. But in January, February, depending on when the main channel gets wrapped up with what they're doing down there, we actually got permission from the Bell Museum over in St. Paul, or Roseville, I suppose, that they had I helped find a elephant humerus that was just in their collections that they had no use for, basically, that had not been curated well. And they were going to just put in their teaching collections and not worry about it. And I kind of raised my hand and was like, hey, we have a really big flume that would be really interesting to look at the size scaling of things. Does an elephant limb bone move the same way that this would? And what aspects of size actually impact that? And sure enough, they were very willing to collaborate with SAFL on that. So pretty soon, we will get to run a bone on the order of about this long down in the main channel, as well as we actually just got an email back today. They're going to let us take some bison as well and run them down there and kind of see, how size scales all the way from bird bones that are that long all the way up to as big as modern animals get today. So that'll be what we're doing soon.
Cool. Well, thank you, Michael. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Let's see. All right. Just get that out of the way.
All right. So we're going to transition into our next part of the event, and I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Omid Mohseni here back to St. Anthony Falls Lab. Omid is a senior water resource engineer and a vice president at Barr Engineering Company. Omid earned his bachelor's degree in 1986 from the University of Science and Technology in Tehran. Then he traveled to Minnesota, where he completed his master's in 95, and in 1999 completed his PhD here at St. Anthony Falls Lab. And I had the pleasure of overlapping with Omid during those years, and I can tell you, for those in our student group, Omid was the one running the basketball tournament. He would have been the student council kind of organizer for happy hours and everything fun. So he brings a lot of energy and positivity wherever he goes and throughout his career. Omid joined Barr in 2001, but within a couple years pushed pause on that path and came back to St. Anthony Falls, where he served as the Associate Director of Engineering for about 5 or 6 years, until 2008, when he returned back to Barr Engineering, where he's been ever since, doing lots of different kinds of work in water engineering, whether it's hydraulic structures, stormwater, BMPs, different kinds of modeling of lakes and watersheds. He's been doing a lot of different kinds of projects, and we'll hear some of that today. Omid is also a teacher at heart, in my opinion. He's served as formerly as an adjunct faculty here at the University of Minnesota, teaching undergraduate class. I just heard Chris Miller and reminiscing how hard Omid was as an instructor, teaching hydrology, hydraulic structures, open channel flow, those kinds of topics for a long time. And I believe Omid even taught down at Mankato State, Minnesota for a period of time. On a personal note, Omid has really been a gift for SAFL, for me personally, but also many of us in the lab right now. And perhaps it's true for those of you that worked with Omid at Barr. He's been a real gift here, and the work he did and contributions he made as associate director, we're still benefiting from him today. He was actually designed the head tank and tail tank, and much of the outdoor stream lab that got built and is used for a long time. He did a lot of renovations downstairs of facilities. I think even the tilting bed flume that we just heard about was renovated under Omid. And for me, most importantly, Omid kind of pushed a reset on the applied research that happens here. He laid a really nice foundation for the associate directors that came after him, and that group was really strong under Omid because of his work. So we're really glad to have you here, Omid. Welcome back, and we're looking forward to your presentation. Please help me welcome Omid.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor to come to Nels Nelson Memorial Fellowship Seminar and being the invitee, the guest speaker. I was hired by Barr back in 2001, and Nels hired me. That was the first time that I went to Barr. Then I left Barr. I came to St. Anthony Falls, as Jeff said. And then I went back to Barr, and that was 2008. And again, Nels hired me again. So he hired me twice. I think that one of the I think, interesting memories that I have. It was the first time that I truly worked with him. He was very smart. I think that what Jeff said, this is mine, okay. All right. He was very smart and very intelligent and very careful about things, and they had amazing information that always impressed me. The first time that I worked with him was that he called me to come and work on a project that they already were working on. They had some problems. It was simulating water surface elevation in a reservoir. And he wanted me to help with that. And I did. And I worked so much that eventually I started to redo some of the things, and I simulated water surface elevation in the reservoir. We had records of about, I don't know, 70, 80 years. It was a very long record. And the whole goal was to show that we had a good model and we could really tell our clients that we understand everything about that reservoir. When I did my work, I looked at it and I saw that the model looks fine. 40 years of data, we are really simulating water surface elevation quite closely. Another 40 years, there is something off by 1.5 feet. And then there are 2 events that there is no observed data. And that was basically during the drought of early 1930s. And our model was showing a huge dip. And then there is another event, which is sometime in the early 1940s, that the data, the observed data, showed a big dip, and our model was not simulating it. I went to Nels, I said, I really don't know what has happened. I think the model is fine, but I cannot explain it. And what he said to me, go to the DNR office, downtown St. Paul. There is an office there, and they have a lot of file cabinets. They have a file cabinet on this reservoir. Go and talk to them and tell them that you want to come and visit, set a time, go through that file cabinet, see what you find on this reservoir. And I said, you think that's it? He said, yep. So I spent 3 days, and it was amazing. I went through letters. I went through communications of the people of the community. First of all, I found out that at some point the datum had changed. So that 1.5 feet, it was a datum change. That was, I was guessing. But those 2 dips, I could not predict what had happened until I went way back and looked at the letters from people complaining that the gates of that reservoir were leaking and water surface elevation is dropping. This is not right. And there were lots of complaints about that. And then a couple of them, they said that the water surface elevation has dropped so much that it looks like early 1930s. It was so funny. I mean, I couldn't believe that easily we could find out and justify what we had done for the modeling. It was his wisdom, his way of thinking, and how he could find solutions. I feel that I was lucky that I was hired to work at BART twice, both times by Nels. Okay, today I'm going to talk about tailings dam breach analysis. You listened to a very good talk and a very different talk. So the talk that I'm going to give you today, it's engineering. So today this is the memorial for Nels Nelson, and I thought that switching a little bit to a topic which is quite different. I'm talking about engineering and engineering application. And the truth is, in research institutes, you work on interesting problems. You address fundamental questions in science, and at times also applied. And then eventually, we engineers, we pick them up, and then we have to use them to find a solution to the problems and questions raised for our communities. And this is one of those. And sometimes we run into problems that we need to be creative because we don't have the answers from academia. So tailings dam breach is one of those stories. Good. So I'm going to go through a brief history of dam failures and dam breach analysis in general. So I'm going to talk about basically water retaining dams, and then I switch to tailing dams, and then I talk about the main differences between these two methods or these two breach analysis for two different types of dams, and then I will have my closing remarks. A little bit about history of dam failure and dam breach analysis. Just for your information, and you all may know it, there are about 90,000 dams in the US, and about 800,000, actually the data is all over the place. If you Google it, they may say there is about 1 million. But somewhere around 800,000 dams worldwide. And total number of dam failure in the US, we don't know it. But the National Performance of Dams program of Stanford University, they have been reporting there has been an average of about 10 failures a year over the period of record. And when we talk about period of record, the earliest dam failure on record goes back to 1848 for Bancroft Dam in Massachusetts. The truth is, the majority of the dam failures do not result in any fatalities. Something around 96% of them, they don't. It's a very small percentage of those dam failures that they have fatalities. And not all dams, they fail. At least based on the records that we have, not all of them fail. It's true that the humans have built dams since 5,000 years ago, and many of them are not there anymore, but there's still some from the Roman era. So I'm going to go and just bring up some of the important dam failure. These are all water retaining dams that happen in the United States. And first one is 1874 in Mill River Dam in Massachusetts. That resulted in 139 fatalities. Then 1889, and this is the South Fork Dam failure in Johnston, Pennsylvania. This is actually close to where I'm living. I'm in Pittsburgh, so this is a little bit to the east of Pittsburgh. And this dam actually failed twice. The second time in 1889, that was probably the worst event as far as the fatalities related. More than 2,200 people died in that failure. And then there were a number of dam failures. It happened, don't think that nothing else happened, but we said that we had an average of 10 per year based on the University of Stanford data. But there were quite a number of dam failures back in the 1970s. Buffalo Creek Dam in West Virginia, Canyon Dam in South Dakota, Teton Dam in Idaho, Lauren Ron Dam in Pennsylvania, and Toccoa Falls Dam in Georgia. And they all had fatalities, 200, 36, 11, 39. And that changed the story. The act of the 1978 Reclamation, Safety of Dams for Bureau of Reclamation, that happened in 1978. And then we had the federal guidelines for dam safety in 1979. The this is all resulted for serious decision about dam safety, and part of the dam safety was also dam breach analysis. And I add something else to this. In addition to these dam failures that happened in the United States, there was a major dam failure that happened back in the 1970s, actually 1975 in China. They experienced a very extreme event from a typhoon in 1975, and a number of dams, they failed. There was a cascading failure. They didn't report exactly what happened until 2005. The official record says about 20,000 people, there were 20,000 fatalities for that event in China. But there also, you may hear that people may say 200,000, 170,000. But if you even stick to the 20,000, that was a big number. So that also had an impact to go for this federal guidelines for dam safety. And as part of that was doing dam breach analysis. But the dam breach analysis did not start in the 1970s. It started in the 1960s due to some failures that happened in California. And initially, they were analytical methods. The analytical methods were quite simple because they had to find a solution to the problem. So looking at a channel, looking at a hydraulic problem, you have just an obstruction in front of water, and if you remove it, how there is a flood wave and it's going to go down the stream. So they did it back then using simple wave theory plus the momentum equation. And it would have no dissipation of the energy. It would basically tell us what would be the height of the flood wave and the speed of the wave going down the stream. Then started developing computer programs in the 1980s, developing some empirical parametric models based on the previous records. This shows it very nicely that, you know, when you see that TP on that column, it's just the time for the breach formation. The B that you see in the middle column, that's average breach width, and then QP is the peak of the flow as a result of a dam failure. And you see the name of different researchers who did this based on the data. So some of them, they had like 6 failures that they used the data, 21 and so forth, and they developed these parametric models for them. In addition to that, a lot of physically based models were developed. So the main one was breach, developed by Fried. And Fried is known as the father of dam breach analysis. The first dam breach model program was prepared by Fried, and also the physically based model, just the breach development also was by Fried. And it was looking at just erosion. It was looking at shear stress and the material of the dam and how it would erode. Then the software programs started coming in, 1980s, 1990s, 2000. And it was not easy to work with these software programs. That National Weather Service dam break model, that was quite a challenge to work with until HECRAS came with a nice GUI. I know when I talk about these things, for many of the younger graduate students here may seem a little bit foreign, but there are a lot of things that they seem very easy to work with today. It was not easy at that time. That's a fact. And just for your information, still many of them are not easy to work with when it comes to dam breach because of the hydraulic problems associated with them. So the programs also started developing for the breach formation. And in all these programs, they would simplify the story. They would say this is basically a trapezoidal shape, and if you have overtopping, so how this trapezoid would start developing from the top all the way extending to the bottom and also expanding laterally. some simplifications, and trying to address the problem. And right now, we have a number of physically based models just to predict the shape of the breach. As I have put some of these models, the most probably the one which is being used probably more effectively is DL breach, but there are a number of them which are out there. And there are lots of hydraulic models for just routing the flood wave. And right now, we are using a lot of the two-dimensional hydraulic models. It doesn't mean that these models are there and they're doing the good job. You just use them, put the input data and run it and get the result. It doesn't work like that. Still, it's a lot of work, a lot of challenging questions, a lot of glitches, and sometimes things do not work the way that you want because of all the data, and because right now we can collect a lot of data, we can provide a lot of details, we have other challenges, but by and large, we are doing a good job. The only thing that we have problems with is with just the breach shape that we have problems. In addition to that, we also have a lot of guidelines, especially federal government, FERC and FEMA, they have guidelines how to do the dam breach analysis. So now this is the question. What is currently understood about dam breach analysis? What is really currently understood about dam breach analysis for water retaining dams? The truth is we cannot predict exactly how a dam fails. We can simulate a dam breach analysis, but don't think that we can predict it. We can't have the precise timing and extent of the dam breach. We can't forecast that, but we can go with the worst case scenario. We can say if the dam fails, what would be the worst case scenario? And based on the worst case scenario, we basically can use it for emergency action plans or emergency response plans. And that's also based on the past events that we can do that. And we can simulate the flood wave movement. We can get the time of flood wave reaching a specific location. We can tell what is the highest flood levels at key points and the areas that would be inundated. And all these things are for developing emergency action plan. And the main goal of emergency action plan is just basically establishing some monitoring system to detect the potential failures and trying to define the responsibilities for the emergency responders and also the dam owners, and coming up with some warning system, evacuation system with the inundation dams. And when I talk about inundation maps, and I'm talking about some map I have taken just a zoom in portion of it. The blue just shows the inundated area. These are the structures that it's showing. So the yellow, as you see, that it's not showing it here. I probably have, that's okay. You can see the yellow block at the bottom of the slide. That's the building which is impacted, and you can basically report that, when the arrival time is from the time of the dam breach, what is the time to peak, and what is the amount of incremental rise. And this was really not much of a story. This guy does not experience much of a flooding because it's just at the edge. But there are probably buildings for some dam failure that would experience a large increase in water level. But we can provide these maps that will be used for emergency response plans. And eventually preparing for rescue, recovery, and termination of the emergency. We can do all these things. And so we are in a good position with respect to water retaining dams. The main puzzle that we have is just the breach formation. We make a lot of guesswork for that. So we're good. What about tailings dams? Are they any different? Let's talk about tailings dams. Tailings dams is whenever you have some sort of operation, mining operation, whether underground or on the surface. You take the material, you take the ore to the processing plant, and processing plant, it basically separates the minerals and bring the waste, and it puts it in a basin. Often the basin is, it's constructed by making some embankment. They create a basin and they bring the material from the processing plant. This is the waste, and they dump it there. Because they often pump it, you get a little pond on top, and the tailings, the waste at the bottom. They fill it up. When it fills up, they may raise the embankment and then put more on top. So this becomes a tailings basin, and what you see around it, it becomes the dam. And the pond, we call it supernatant pond. And the method of construction is sometimes upstream. And as I showed you, the reason that it's called upstream construction method is because they started with a starter dam. They filled with the waste, with the tailings. When it's filled, the next raise or lift, part of the dam is going to sit on the waste which was already deposited there. So part of the dam is on soft material or not strong enough, or it could be that it's not strong enough. And that these dams, the height can go up quite a bit. You may see 100 feet, 200 feet high dams, that they are built on the waste. So it makes the dam not necessarily quite stable. But there is also central method. The central method, they build it on top and extend it to the downstream side. So part of the dam is going to be on the ground, and it's much more reliable as the dam. And the one which is the downstream method, as you can see, there is nothing built on the tailings. So this is, again, it's a much better one than the central method with respect to the firmness and the stability and our trust in the safety of the dam. The upstream method is the one which is the one we may see more problems. But have in mind, both the central method and downstream method means that the dam owner must have more property downstream of the dam footprint so it can extend it like this. So there is an issue with the property. If they don't have the property, they will go with the upstream method. So that's the method that you see most places with respect to the tailings basins. That's the common one. And that's the one which also is not as safe as the other two methods that you see. And the dams can be built on basically a cross valley. It can be in a side hill impoundment. It can be above the ground. That's a ring dike. Most of the dams in the Midwest, in Minnesota, for example, are ring dike or above ground. And as you go to the west, the mountainous area is going to be in the side hill. And there are also some that they are below grade. Those are not dams anymore. This is just a tailings basin. So when we talk about the failure of the tailings dam, we're not, well, the first part is very much the same, like any water retaining dams. But then it's also the uncontrolled and sudden release of any or all stored materials. That's what makes the dam failure of a tailings dam quite different. Just going through a little bit of a history of tailings dam failures, and just I selected some. This is my selection. It doesn't mean that if you open anything, it's going to give you the same list. Some of the recent one, in my opinion, 1960s is recent. I know for many of you it's not. That's in China, in Hugudugu, or Hugudugu, if I'm not pronouncing it correctly, I apologize. About 3.3 million cubic meters of tailings was released and more than 170 fatalities. And El Cobre, Chile, 0.35 million cubic meters of tailings, but 200 fatalities. So as you can see that it's not just the volume, a lot of things. The setting, the presence of communities, and where the topography, what the topography is, and what height the dam has, all those things, they can have an effect. That happened in 1965, 1972, Buffalo Creek, West Virginia, 500,000, 125 fatalities. Italy, 1985, 0.2 million, 268. China, 2008, Tuashi, almost 2 million cubic meters, 277. And 2019, this was a big one. This is Brumadinho, 12 million cubic meters with 259 fatalities. There have been more tailings dam failure after that. The main one with some fatalities was in South Africa. This was the Jagerfontein in South Africa with 2 fatalities and 1 missing, 5 million cubic meters. But if in case you haven't seen this video, I am going to show it to you to give a little bit of perspective of a failing a tailings dam failure. This tailings dam was not active. It happened in January of 2019. They had cameras. This is one of the quite unique cases that they had cameras installed at different locations, and that's why we have videos of this dam failure. We don't have these type of videos from any failure. Actually, that triggered quite a bit of effort on tailings dam breach analysis. Global industry standard developed in 2020. CDA, Canadian Dam Association, they published the first bulletin in 2021. Don't think that it was in response to that bulletin for tailings dam breach analysis. It started in 2015 and it was completed in 2021, but the draft was referenced in the global industry standard on tailings management. And a short section was allocated in 2022 in Tailings Management Handbook, a life cycle approach by the Society of Mining, Metallurgy, and Exploration. And then International Commission on Large Dams, ICOLD, also published a bulletin in basically, I didn't put the time for that. I think it's 2024, if I'm not mistaken. I didn't put a time on that. No, 2025. This one is 2025. So what really is the difference between tailings dam breach and the water retaining dam? The breach shape and dimensions can be very different. But the problem is that we have a hard time estimating the breach shape and the dimensions of water retaining dams. So the best we can do is go ahead and use whatever data is there for water retaining dams and use it for tailings dams. That's the best we can do, using whatever the physically based model is available or some of the data, some of the parametric models out there. That's what we can do. But the next one, which is quite different is the mobilization of tailings. And that's an important difference between a tailings dam breach and a water retaining. And then the runout is going to be different. As you saw in the movie, what was really moving was not water. It was basically a non-Newtonian fluid flow that you saw. So the runout characteristics can be all over the place. It can be water, it can be hyper-concentrated flow with low or high concentration of sediments, or it can become mud and debris flow. The problem is the process is very complex. I'm going to try just to show you in a cartoon that why it becomes complex. What we saw for Brumadinho was, again, a specific case. In most cases, what we're dealing with, it doesn't mean that it's always like this, but you have some tailings and you have some pond on top. There may be that there is no pond, as we saw, and the tailings may not have the same characteristics as you saw for Brumadinho, but we can have quite a bit of a range. But I'm going to show you why it becomes quite a challenging problem. Let's imagine that we have a tailings dam and we have some initial piping, and that initial pipe conduit is going to expand over time, and so you will have head cutting at the downstream end, and at some point it collapses that conduit, and so therefore there will be a settlement of the dam, and you will get overtopping, and then the dam will be washed out because of all the pond water coming from the pond washing off the dam. And you get quite a bit of basically muddy flow or hyper-concentrated flow coming out of it. But then, because of the problem with the stability of the tailings behind it, you may see an initial backscarp or just unstable tailings standing there. And when that happens, if the tailings are liquefiable, then you may see the liquefaction of the tailings. And then you will see even more material coming out. The liquefied tailings, the eroded tailings and the water, the way that they mix and how they come into play, it's the question that it's not easy to answer. And right after that, if the pond is still there, you will have some nick points and you will have more erosion coming in and more material is going to come out. So trying to get all that right, it's quite a challenge. And when this problem started being studied, we ran into lots of questions. But the first efforts were done by Rico back in 2007. What she did, she looked at 29 tailings dam failures, and she came up with a nice, simple linear regression. And she said, you know what? About 35% of the volume of the material in a tailings basin, that will be mobilized. And that's what we can use. And initially it was used by some people, but after some time it was challenged because there were cases that only 1% of the material was mobilized, and in some cases the entire basin was mobilized. So everybody thought that this database was not a good database to build on it. This may not be the case. So when CDA started working, they had a working group for tailings dam breach analysis. It was a combination of the hydraulic engineers and geotechnical engineers, and there was quite a bit of effort to see that how we can bring in the estimate of the mobilized tailings into the picture. One of the first things that they did was basically classifying the type of tailings basins. They came up with this matrix. It's a matrix of 2 by 2, but let me explain it this way. This is a little bit easier. This tailings basin, As you can see, case 1A and case 2A, the tailings are liquefiable, but 1A, which is on top, it also has a pond. The 2A does not have a pond. Actually, 2A is very much like Bermudinho that you saw just right now. There was no pond, but it was liquefiable. Now, if you look at it across this, 1A and 1B, the tailings is basically liquefiable for 1A, and for 1B, it's not, but both of them, they have pond. So for the ones that you have pond, you definitely have erosion when the water is coming out. With the one that you have liquefiable tailings, you can have liquefaction when the dam fails. The last one, which is 2B, it's neither liquefiable nor erosion because there's no pond there. But if the dam fails, it becomes more like a landslide. And it becomes more like a geotechnical failure that you can take a look at. And the examples, we have seen it quite a bit. This is the 1994, that was in South Africa, Maris Pruitt Dam. The one to the right is the case 1B, 2014, Mount Polley in Canada. That was basically eroded. It was just the material, they were eroded. There were some reports that some liquefaction was seen, but if there was anything, it was quite localized. But basin-wise, it was just the erosional process which mobilized the tailings coming out of the basin when the dam failed. The third one is Fundão 2015 in Brazil, and it was like Bermudinho. There was no water in the basin. It was all liquefaction. And case 2B is the Clinton Creek in 1985, that it was basically a landslide for the tailings basin. So in CDA, they simplify, they say that we can look at the problem, because the problem is complex, we can simplify it and we can define them as two main processes. The first one is the discharge of the supernatant pond, that it basically brings out all the eroded sediment and dam fill materials downstream. That's process one. Process two, so it all empties. Process two is basically the discharge of all the flowable tailings. Either it's going to be due to liquefaction or progressive slumping. So these are the two processes that we can tackle it in order to do the dam breach analysis. So how to approximate the volume of mobilized tailings? We can do it based on the volume of the pond, means the water that we have there, the basin geometry, and the tailings geotechnical characteristics. Based on those, we can estimate the volume of eroded tailings. And we also have do some analysis to see that if the tailings are liquefiable, do some liquefaction analysis and determine the volume of liquefied tailings. So these are all, means quite a bit of work and help from geotechnical engineers. With respect to erosion, there has been quite a bit of work. We really can approximate it. The one which is on the left, that's the Jaggers, this is the Jaggers-Fonstein in South Africa. And the main processes in that one was erosional processes with respect to the mobilized volume. The second picture, as you see, this is some laboratory work done in some university showing that when the main process is basically erosion, how you see channelization over the surface of the tailings, especially in the cone of depression. And the last one is a computer model, a 2D computer model trying to simulate the erosional processes of tailings base. I think this is an experiment done at Queen's University. And this was basically looking at, I don't know how well you can see it. They put a notch here. This is the plan view. You're looking at everything at the basin. There is sediment upstream, but they put a notch and they initiated the breach. And they were looking at just the erosional processes. And as if you focus, see that how there's a cone of depression here, and you can see that how it's going to expand as the breach basically advances and progresses. As you can see, the failure that you see from the side of the channel of the breach, these are all geotechnical failures. And when you try to come up with a model of only looking at the erosional processes, you miss these stability problems that you can run into. So in fact, if you want to do a good job with respect to predicting dam breach formation, sticking just to hydraulic characteristics and shear stresses is not going to work. You have to look at the stability of the side slopes of the breach as it expands. And it's going to come as sudden changes. But it's also interesting, as you see, it's start eroding the material inside of the basin as well. It's not just a breach expansion, it's extending into the basin. And for your information, it is not necessarily possible to do laboratory scale work to simulate liquefaction. And that's a tough one to do. But we can look at the erosion, and I think that this is quite interesting, that how it expands with respect to erosion. So we can approximate the erosional processes of the tailings as the water leaves. Liquefaction is going to be a little bit of a challenge, and we need geotechnical analysis. And often liquefaction needs a trigger. With respect to dam break, the trigger would be just the failure of the dam itself, because as the dam fails, the containment is going to be gone, and now you may have the liquefaction of the tailings. So we can estimate the volume of liquefied tailings from basin geometry, from the breach geometry, from basin geometry, and also the characteristics of the tailings. So if we have a ring dike, we can, based on the breach opening and the characteristics, we can figure out what part of the basin is going to be mobilized. There will be an initial backscarp, and with the liquefaction or basically progressive slumping of the tailings, we can estimate that how much more tailings would be mobilized. In this case, we are trying to basically give you an example of the liquefied tailings. We can also simplify the problem based on the characteristics that we run into based on the supernatant pond. If it's quite large supernatant pond, and we can claim that that process one that I talked about is dominating and just focus on that. But if the pond is too small or way away from the breach location, we can ignore that and just focus on process two, especially if we think that the tailings are liquefiable. But in many cases, that's not the case, and we have a pond, and we have tailings that are liquefiable. We can come up with an alternative approach, and the alternative approach is basically come up with these estimates and say that all the tailings that are liquefied and are eroded, they get well mixed with the water and they all come as one entity. And in reality, they don't. But it's the easiest way to deal with it. And if we do, now we have one fluid coming out of the system. We can model the flow of that fluid, and we can look at the impacts. That is an important part of this whole thing to make it work. So now if this is the basin looking from the top, and that's the breach opening, that's the breach opening, we can estimate what part would liquefy and what additional part would basically erode because of the volume of the water. In cross-section, if that's the dam, and we will have some initial erosion of the first part, but this will be the part which will be liquefied, and the next part behind it will be eroded. And we can estimate those. So what we do is we basically can use the residual shear stress ratio of the tailings material and just approximate that slope of the post-liquefaction failure and use that, come up with the volume that would liquefy behind the dam. If that's the opening, so we will have a parallelogram, which I'm showing you by V2 on the plan view, and 2 quarter cone of V1s on each side, and I can estimate those and use that as the volume of the tailings that are mobilized and come up with the volume of the tailings which are also eroded and tell you that what is the total volume of runout. That shape that we are showing, even though it's a simplification, it's not too far off because we see similar to that in some historical failure, like Mears Pruitt back in 1994 in South Africa. And based on the geometry of the basin, it may not be two, quarter of cones on the side. It depends on where the breach is and what the shape the basin has, and you can come up with those estimates. But one of the other questions that came up is, what if the failure mode is foundation liquefaction? And we may be able to, under certain circumstances, we basically combine those process 1 and process 2 and come up with the volume of the mobilized tailing. And this is going to be in a special case. The truth is, if you have a dam, and just imagine an embankment dam with the water behind it, if you have a foundation failure and you have settlement of the crest, at some point it may settle such a way that the water will exceed the crest and it goes over it, and as the deformation basically extends, this becomes more, and you will have the water coming out of the basin. So we can use the same concept in a sense that we can do this in 2 steps. The first step is doing just the deformation analysis, means looking at the liquefaction of the foundation and how the whole thing deforms, and use that as our first step, and then assume that now we have a very slender dam on top of it and breach that. And this is like overtopping, and we can incorporate the erosion of the sediment behind it, the tailings behind it, and running out of the basin. This is like an example of that. So this was the dam. If it deforms, if this part of the dam deforms, as I'm showing you, then it becomes this big because it's all going to move. So we will have a new geometry. So there will be overtopping because the crest is going to drop. But like any big dam that it overtops, you will have a section of it that will be eroded, and that would be used to basically discharge the eroded tailings and the pond. And you can simulate it like that. The truth is, this part is arbitrary right now. It can be moved to the right or left for some sensitivity analysis to see that which case would be the worst. So this was all about the mobilization of the tailings. The next one, which is different, is going to be the runout characteristics. There are only a few slides left. I know that I was told that I can only talk until 4:15. I'm going a little bit over my allocated time, but it's going to be done very soon. With respect to runout characteristics, the runout characteristics actually can change based on the sediment content or solids content of the runout. And this figure is actually showing it very nicely. It's showing basically sediment concentration by weight on the vertical axis, by volume on the horizontal axis, but it's telling you that how the outflow or how the flow overall is different. I think I can use this. I don't know if it's gonna. So the first was when the sediment concentration by volume, if you look at it, is less than 20%. It behaves more like water flood. The concentration is still small. As you get above 20%, then it becomes more like a mud flood. And if you get roughly about 45%, then you start seeing totally a different type of system, and this is more like mud flow. And after that, this is completely different. And this may be just like a landslide. So based on the concentration of the material, we can predict that how it's going to behave. If it's a water flood, it has a viscosity of similar to water, but when it becomes mud flood, then the viscosity changes. This is all based on the work that O'Brien did, but the work that the data that O'Brien has provided, that comes from the National Research Council work back in the 1980s. There is a little bit of a range, but this can tell you based on the solids content how it behaves and what you need to consider with respect to runout. So this is probably a figure many of you have seen. This is talking about basically we're talking about the Newtonian fluid, that the shear stress, it linearly changes with the shear rate. Then we have the non-Newtonian, we have dilatant material, or we have pseudoplastic material that they're either shear thickening or shear thinning. And we also have simple Bingham. In many of the problems that we solve, we try to use this approach, but you can also incorporate, based on the characteristics of the tailings, a different type of non-Newtonian behavior. But in many cases, it's a simple Bingham, so it's not going to start moving until some tau naught. And then after that, the relationship between the shear stress and the shear rate is linear. And that's what we incorporate. And based on the data analysis done, we can estimate, and by the way, if you remember, the slope of the relationship is basically the apparent viscosity. And for Newtonian, it's going to be constant, but for non-Newtonian, it varies. So there have been quite a bit of work done to determine the dynamic viscosity as a function of the CV. This is basically telling us the solids content by volume. There is a little bit of a scatter, but overall, and this is semi-logarithmic plot, if you look at it. So the relationship looks linear on a semi-log plots. Same thing with respect to the yield stress. And we can collect these data based on what we know and basically incorporate it into our model, or basically the momentum equation. And this is the general momentum equation for water flow. First time, what Fried did, he modified this momentum equation by adding another term to the forces, because your first force is, your first term in the parentheses is the gravity, and this is basically friction forces. This is another friction forces, but this represents the viscosity, the non-Newtonian behavior of the system. And you can estimate SMD based on the yield stress and the apparent viscosity of the fluid and modify your momentum equation. And that's what basically most of these models, they do. And it gives quite a bit of a different scenario and different results. This is a hypothetical tailings basin, but in a real topography. That oval shape is that tailings basin. What you see as light blue, yellow, pink, and green are 4 different types of tailings. If the tailings were all water, blue would have been basically the pattern of showing the inundated areas after 24 hours if the dam would breach. And the yellow and the pink and the green are with different kind of rheological characteristics with respect to the solids content. So you can see the CV of 0.45 is just at the beginning of being non-Newtonian is the green one. It would reach after 24 hours, that red line first. But if the amount of solids content increases to 0.5, you see that it doesn't expand much. And the truth is what happens, it's much thicker too, and it moves more slowly. You can't say if I assume water, this is going to be more conservative. Not necessarily, because you are missing a lot of areas which could be impacted if the tailings were behaving like a non-Newtonian fluid. So that's why it's really important to know how it behaves to really determine what areas are being impacted and what would be the depth, and what we could have either fatalities or economic losses due to dam failure. So the main thing for doing a tailings dam breach analysis is to estimate geotechnical information related to tailings, identify potential failure modes, and then going through estimating the breach parameters, defining the cases, whether it's 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, and then assess the mobilized volume of the tailings and come up with a breach hydrograph and route it downstream. Come up with something like that. The tailings, this is just an example. The tailings are, this is the tailings basin with a breach location. A river is moving from the right of the screen to the left. The light blue is the inundated as a result of inundation, inundated areas as a result of this tailings basin breach. So I close it out by tailing dam breach analysis. It basically requires, it's very different from what we used to do for just the water retaining dam breach analysis. It's basically a work together between geotechnical and hydraulic engineers. Still is an approximation, and in certain situations, we are not 100% sure that we are being conservative because lack of our knowledge and understanding. And that comes primarily with respect to the breach development. And still, even though we can approximate the runout volume, but there are quite a bit of uncertainties with respect to that and the runout behavior. We are simplifying the problem. And that's the main thing. As engineers, you're always asked to find the solution to your problem, and what you do is you find a solution to the problem with the hope that your solution, given the state of knowledge and resources available to you, is the best solution. But having in mind that if you're told you need to come up with a solution in 1 week or in 1 month or in 3 years, the solution is going to be very different because of all the time that you have to spend on the problem. At the same time, it's also important what we really know about a lot of physical processes around us that we can incorporate. Thank you.
Thank you, Omid. Questions?
So, Omid, you mentioned that a liquefied mobilization of liquefied sediments is not possible through a hydraulic model, and I'm wondering what the main reason is.
Oh, because of you don't have the stresses enough to make it liquefy. You may be able to do dynamic liquefaction. A lot of the dams that they fail, they have static liquefaction, and you will have a hard time simulating static liquefaction. But you can do a dynamic liquefaction. So if you make a model and you have basically a floor with something that you can shake it, you can make them liquefy. But that is different. Why we can't do this for this type of problem? There are dams that we know of that the failure is because there was an earthquake. So the earthquake was the reason of the failure. And that's because the earthquake occurred, there was a dynamic liquefaction. Because of the type of construction, the system started just failing because of that liquefaction. It was the dam and the tailings. That happens. But in many of these cases, like in Minnesota, we don't have much of a seismic forces to cause the dam failure. The main loading is basically hydrologic loading. So you either have overtopping, that still does not happen with many of the tailings basins because they designed it in such a way that it won't overtop, but you may have erosion, internal erosion or piping. If that happens and the dam fails, now the thing that does liquefy the tailings is basically that part of the opening. The tailings, they lose containment, and that triggers just the part behind it to liquefy, not the whole basin. So if you shake it, if you do it as a physical model, you shake the whole thing, and the whole thing is going to basically flow. And that's not going to be what's happening out there. What is really liquefying is the area that loses containment, and it liquefies. And it has the potential to liquefy. It doesn't mean that it definitely liquefy, but in our breach analysis, we assume that if the dam fails, it will liquefy. It may not, because it depends on the conditions too. But anytime we think that it's liquefiable for our type of analysis that we do, we say that assume that it's going to liquefy and it's going to move. But then if we liquefied all the tailings in the basin, we're overestimating everything. Could be overestimating big time, not slightly overestimating.
I was thinking in terms of dimensionless numbers. So if you have a fruit-scaled model, you're talking about inertia and gravity. Why couldn't you have that in mobilization of liquefied material? What is missing? What force is there that is not simulated?
Is the weight, is the normal shear stress that we're talking about. You don't have that. Unless you make it large enough, close to basically the prototype, you can do that.
Okay, thank you.
So if it is small, you may not be able to replicate that in the lab. So that's the main problem.
So it's the same problem that you have with sediment transport, actually.
Yes, it's the same problem. Still with sediment transport, we can do something. We go for some surrogate for sediment transport, but that's correct. In that sense, it is.
Other questions? I have one, Omid. The interior of tailings are often not homogeneous.
That's correct.
So have you put thought into thinking of structures or stratigraphy or sorting that happens in a model?
No, because right now the models, right now what we do is an approximation, assuming everything is homogeneous. With respect to homogeneous characteristics of the tailings, we are approximating. Now you want to bring the heterogeneity of the tailings, because you can have compaction, and you can have consolidation of the tailings, especially when they are putting the tailings for years and years and years, and sometimes they even do some work to basically consolidate the tailings. So you will have a very different characteristics from the bottom to the top. That's going to be a challenge to say that which part would definitely not liquefy or liquefy. That will be a challenging question. And we try, when something like that happens, we try to get the geotechnical engineers come and tell us that, is it going to liquefy or not? Or are you going to look at it in a different way? They try to be on the conservative side of the system because of the size and lack of knowledge of everything. But I think we're not yet there, unless at some point we can map it very nicely and tell them that, yeah, we think that this part is not going to move, but that part is going to move.
Other questions? Chris.
Welcome back, by the way. A couple of things. One is, in the simplified model where you figure that a certain triangular area in cross-section gets liquefied and goes, you have an alpha for that.
Yes.
Well, that matters, right?
Yes.
Because
yes.
your triangle is going to be related to, where does that come from?
That alpha that you were talking about, that's basically the residual shear stress ratio. And if I'm not, this is basically the post-liquefaction slope angle. We can calculate that. We can calculate that based on the characteristics of the tailings.
On their strength, basically?
Yes, yes. And for that triangles that you talked about, it's like a cone, as you said. Yeah. And we apply that angle to those cones. Right. And also to the section in the middle, which is going to be a parallelogram.
But the angle itself comes from the strength of the material.
Yes.
Which is something you measure or you estimate?
They do measure it. They do CPT tests. Based on the CPT tests that the geotechnical engineers they can come up with what would be that angle. Okay. And that angle is in the order of 4 to 7 or 8 degrees that you can think about. That slope, the angle of that slope is basically that small.
And the other thing I was going to ask, so you have historical tailings-based breaches. You have a model. I assume that you run the data from historical breaches through the model to see how it works. I mean,
the runout.
There must be all kinds of calibration parameters.
But the calibration, no, not necessary. To some extent, the most important, the calibration, it goes back to the viscosity and the yield stress of the material. That's going to be the main parameter to calibrate. But the models that we have run, you can simulate. You can simulate basically the historical record. So the run-out models, they have that capability. It's going to be close. But in those models, we put The breach that we know already had happened, we have some ideas what the size of the breach was. We have some knowledge of how quickly the breach formed. We also know how much material has left the system.
But if you knew, let's say you had, so a lot of the uncertainty is actually how the breach develops. But even if, let's say you knew that, let's say you had a perfect model for that, once, if you could put that into the model, that second, what was it, the second one was?
The volume of the mobilized tailings.
And do you do well with that, or?
Well, what we do, we are hoping that we are a little bit over conservative with that. We are hoping that we are reasonably conservative with that, because it's not necessarily going to happen the way that we think. Because a lot of the material, when they start moving, the sudden move, they block each other as well. So some of it is going to come out, some of it is not. It's possible if you have a big pond, it's going to wash out and mix everything, and everything is going to come out. So we are hoping that the way that we are estimating it, it's reasonably conservative. We're shooting for not being optimistic with respect to that estimate. With respect to simulating the past conditions, we knew how much volume had come out. So that was basically an input to our model, to our hydraulic model. So the hydraulic model, overall, they're doing a decent job with respect to the predictions. The part that is challenging is the breach formation and the volume of mobilized tailings. But we think that we're doing a decent job with respect to that.
Let's thank Omid one more time. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Michael, congratulations. This concludes the Nels Nelson Award ceremony. Thanks for coming, everybody.